Welcome to the 2020 Monthly Color Challenge. This year we have the option of doing a neutral background for all 12 blocks. And to make that a little bit easier for you, I gave you yardage and cutting instructions for just a neutral background so that you can have that cut and ready for each month. So what I've asked you to do is get baggies and mark them. I think you can see it there, 1 through 12. If you don't want to use baggies, a simple system of just writing your number on a piece of paper and then pinning it to that group. And then I recommend having some way of keeping them all together. I will be using a shoebox sized bin and all of my baggies will be in there. I thought I would do a little explanation of cutting yardage and cutting these strips, because there's a lot of strips where we cut and then we cut down again after we get our first units. And so for those that are beginners, maybe it might get a little bit confusing. So I want to just quick go over one. I know the camera angle isn't great. My setup is not awesome for this. But to start with, I've pressed and used starch. I've lined up my selvages. I'll have a link in the comments below to show how to do that to make sure that your fabric is straight. And then I've aligned my fold along the line on the ruler so I know this is straight, and then I want to cut off the edge here to give myself a straight edge. And I'm going to use the mark on the, I'm going to use the lines on the ruler and the lines on my mat just to line up and get that cut nice and straight. And I'm not trimming off a lot. You'll see when I take this off. Oh, and that happens too. I don't know if you noticed, but I totally did not use my ruler, so I went all catawalkus there. So we're going to try again. So I'm cutting off a little bit more than I meant to, but a straight edge is that important. So let's try that again, shall we? Lining up. Apparently I needed a little bit more coffee before I started this. Alright, so making sure your rotary cutter goes along the line of your ruler. We're going to trim that off. Now I do want to show how the top of that fabric was. Oops. Before I really messed up. But here you can see when I lined up my selvages, this is what happens. You don't get these two ends together. They come together when they're cut at the store because they aren't necessarily wrapped straight on the bolt, and that's just something that happens. And so you do need to make sure you give yourself that straight edge before you start cutting. But it's also important to make sure that your selvages are lined up correctly so that you aren't getting blocks that start turning and get wonky because the fabric grain is off. Alright, so our first cut is 7.5 inches. My ruler is 6.5, so we are going to go to the square. And you can use the 7.5 on your mat, but it isn't necessarily as accurate as using a ruler. Now, I line up my ruler line on the fabric, not alongside it, but actually on it. So if you can see, here is my 7.5 inch mark on the ruler, and you can see there's just a little tish on there maybe. The fabric, the ruler does not come over here and line up on the outside of that fabric. It's actually on the fabric like that. So I'm just going to cut up to where my ruler almost ends, And then I'm going to lift my ruler up, not slide it. And again, find that 7.5 on my ruler, lining it up on the fabric. Cut a little bit more. Now this takes a little bit more time, but it does make sure that your cut is correct. Our lines on our, if you ever look at your mat and your rulers and match up those squares, they are not always the same, so it's better to use your rulers. Now usually I would go on to the next cut and leave my yardage on the table as long as possible so I'm not moving it around and having to realign it again. But we are going to continue on just to go through this first strip. So we're going to take our ruler, cut off our selvages. Now my strip is cut lined up on a line just to make sure that I have a straight edge. I'm not using the mat to measure, I'm just using the mat as guidelines for straight edges. So I've cut off the selvage to give myself a nice straight edge. And we are going to cut 2 7.5-inch squares. So now I'm lining up the line on the outside, but I'm also lining up the line on top to make sure that I have a nice square. Okay, and then I recommend, right after that, it says to put one square in baggie 3 and one in baggie 4. And I recommend doing this right away because you don't want to have to start measuring blocks and trying to figure out which one goes in which when you've got a pile. So the 7.5-inch squares are a little bit bigger than my baggies, so I'm just going to fold those up. We'll press them when it's time to sew, but I'll go over that as well because you don't want to press and stretch out your fabric after you've already cut it. Alright, so we're going to fold those, put them in baggies 3 and 4, and put those back in. I've learned that if I just don't put everything away right away, it gets lost. So this is where it might get a little bit confusing for some. We are going to cut this strip down to a different size now. I do this in order to save fabric and make it so you don't have to buy quite as much fabric. And we are using what we need. So we have our strip that's 7.5 inches wide, and we have now cut our 2 7.5-inch squares. Now we need to take the remaining strip down to 6.5. So we're going to do that quick. So we have our 7.5-inch strip, what's left of it. I've got it lined up, not really on the line, but kind of lined up alongside it, so I know that that is straight. But we're going to take our ruler and we need to go 6.5. Now this means that I'm using the entire width of this ruler because this is 6.5. So I want to make sure that I'm lining up that edge, that it is on the fabric and not on the outside of that fabric. So we're going to line up that 6.5. We're simply going to trim off that extra piece. This piece then is in 1 inch, so if you like to do any sort of strip quilts or anything like that, that's a great piece to have. You can set that aside. Now it asks us to take this 6.5 inch and subcut it into 2 6.5-inch squares. So we are going to rotate it carefully so you aren't, you don't want your fabrics to come apart. If they do, just make sure you're lining them up so that they are, all the edges are all together and lined up correctly. Again, this is my 6.5-inch wide ruler, so it is on the edge of the fabric, not off of it. We're going to cut 2 6.5-inch squares. and that says to put them into bag 9. I should probably just leave the cover off of this, except then I'm afraid that I will lose the cover. I'm sure that doesn't happen to any of you, right? Alright, so bag 9. Again, I'm just going to fold those up. And put that in bag 9. Okay, so that was 2 6.5 inch squares. Now we're going to do 2 6.5 by 2.5 units. Oh, and there, that's what I was talking about, where your fabric kind of comes apart when you pull it because it sticks to the mat. So making sure that those edges are all the same. Alright, our next one is 6.5 by 2.5. We need 2 of those. So because this is 6.5, we just need to cut a 2.5 inch piece off of it. And we need 2 of those. And those go into baggie 6. And now our last cuts are going to be 4 3-inch squares. So because this is 6.5, I'm going to leave it like this, and I'm going to cut 1 3-inch strip. And we're going to put this aside. Now you can keep this in case there is a miscut, or you have to rip and you rip the fabric or something. So you want to keep that extra handy. And now I'm going to take this 3-inch strip, and if I did my math right, I should have a 1/2 inch of fabric left after I cut out 4 3-inch squares. Alright, and then those go into baggie 7. And our first strip is done. So you'll just continue along with the instructions, putting the pieces that you've cut into the baggies that you've marked, making sure then to put everything back into your little bin, and you are ready for the 2020 Monthly Color Challenge, which just starts in a couple of days. Happy stitching!